Chapter 1. You said I could crash here. The storm had perfect comedic timing. By the time Ben Hartley reached what he swore was Lily's apartment, the sky had opened like a faucet, soaking him through his hoodie and jeans. His sneakers squelched with every step as he ducked under the awning of the old brick building, hugging his duffel and the box of sugar cookies he'd bought as a thank you gift. The bakery logo had bled into watercolor from the rain. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his hoodie and fumbled with his phone. No signal. Of course. Classic, he muttered. Of course it's the apocalypse when I move in. He stared up at the buzzer panel, blinking through rainwater. Lily Everett, 4B. At least she used to live here, unless she'd moved since her last text 2 months ago, which was technically possible. Ben pressed the button anyway and leaned close to the intercom. Hi, it's Ben. I come bearing snacks and homelessness. A few seconds of static hissed back, followed by a low, sleep-rough voice that wasn't Lily's. You've got the wrong unit. Ben blinked. 4B? Lily Everett? She doesn't live here anymore. The voice was grumpy, clipped, and decidedly masculine. Moved out 6 months ago. Ben frowned at the panel. Wait, but she said I could crash for a week while my new lease clears. I brought cookies. Does that earn me at least 10 minutes of shelter before I drown? Silence. Then the faint sound of a sigh, long, suffering, and deep. A buzz. The door clicked open. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of polish and cedar, a masculine kind of neatness that made Ben suddenly aware of how wet and disheveled he looked. He toed off his shoes and padded toward the open apartment door at the end of the hall, dripping a small puddle behind him. The man who stood there was not the warm, laughing Lily Everett. James Everett, he had to be Lily's older brother, judging from the familiar eyes, leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. He was barefoot, wearing gray sweatpants and a plain black t-shirt that clung to his chest in ways that made Ben's brain briefly forget words. His hair was mussed, like he'd been asleep before Ben ruined his night. Hi. Ben tried for cheerful. Ben Hartley. Your sister's best friend? She said I could. Crash here. Yes. James's voice was as dry as his expression. You picked a great night for it. I brought cookies, Ben said hopefully, holding up the soggy box like a peace offering. James's gaze flicked down to it, then back up to Ben's dripping form, and water damage. I'm very absorbent? A beat of silence. Then, to Ben's surprise, James stepped back with a resigned wave. Fine, one night. Towels are in the guest bath. Don't touch anything fragile. Ben grinned, warmth unfurling in his chest despite the rain still dripping from his hair. Thank you, kind stranger. James muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like regretting this already. James's apartment looked like it belonged in a magazine spread titled Minimalist Success Stories. Steel and walnut, sleek lines, not a single thing out of place. Ben's duffel bag exploded the moment he set it down. Socks, a sketchbook, and what appeared to be a small family of glitter pens scattered across the polished floor. Sorry. Ben scrambled to gather them, bumping into a coffee table stacked with architectural models under glass domes. Wow, these are gorgeous. Did you build? Please don't touch that. James's voice carried the exact tone one used for please don't detonate the bomb. Ben straightened, hands raised in surrender. Noted. No touching, no detonating, no singing. James exhaled through his nose, crossing his arms. His cedar and smoke scent filled the room, grounding, sharp, and unfairly addictive. Ben caught himself inhaling before quickly pretending to study his wet sleeves. I'll grab you a towel, James said, retreating toward the hallway, muttering something about ventilation. He cracked a window like Ben's pear honey scent was somehow too much. Ben smirked to himself. You're welcome, Mr. Grumpy Air Freshener. The shower was heaven. Hot water, lavender soap that smelled expensive, steam curling against pale tiles. Ben's clothes, however, were beyond saving. James, he called through the door. Any chance I could borrow something to wear? A pause. Footsteps. Then a folded black shirt appeared at the edge of the doorway, an arm extending it without eye contact. It's all I have clean, James said curtly. Ben peeked around the corner, just in time to see him looking pointedly away, jaw tight. He accepted the shirt with a bright, thanks. It was enormous on him. Soft cotton that fell halfway down his thighs, the neckline wide enough to slip off one shoulder. He felt like a kid playing dress-up, and somehow it felt cozy. After toweling his curls dry, Ben wandered barefoot into the kitchen, humming tunelessly as he explored. The cabinets were obsessively organized, everything labeled in block letters. Then he spotted it. The snack shelf. Neatly arranged bags of kettle chips, almonds, chocolate bars. Jackpot. He grabbed a handful of chips and popped one into his mouth just as the fridge light caught the wet sheen on his skin. He leaned back against the counter, nibbling contentedly, when a deep voice froze him mid-crunch. "You're in my pantry." Ben turned, startled. James stood in the doorway, hair still messy, expression a mix of irritation and disbelief. His gaze flicked down Ben's legs, then snapped back up, throat working. "I was hungry," Ben said around a mouthful, waving the chip bag. "Emergency carbs?" James blinked, voice rough. "Those are portioned." "Not anymore." Ben smiled, all innocence. They stared at each other, rain still whispering outside, the air thick with cedar and honey and something unspoken. James finally broke the spell, dragging a hand through his hair. "You can eat, just not the entire shelf." "Got it, half only." His lips twitched. Almost a smile, but not quite. He turned toward the fridge, grabbed a bottle of water, and muttered, "You're impossible." Compliment accepted. They ended up in the living room, an unspoken truce forming the hum of the rain and the quiet thump of Ben arranging his pillow fort on the couch. James stood over him, arms crossed. "House rules," he said. 1, don't touch the models. 2, no singing after 10. 3, no unapproved pantry raids. Ben held up 3 fingers, mock serious. "Copy-ish." "Copy?" James began, but Ben was already curling up beneath the blanket, yawning. He looked ridiculous and heartbreakingly soft, bare legs tucked under him, shirt swallowing his frame, curls damp against his forehead. "Thanks, Grumpy," Ben mumbled sleepily. James sighed. "You don't even know me." "Then you should frown less. Makes introductions easier." Ben's voice faded into slow, even breaths. James stood there for a moment, conflicted between irritation and something quieter, heavier. He fetched another blanket from the closet, draped it over Ben's shoulders without a word, and switched off the lamp. At the doorway, he muttered under his breath, "This was a mistake." Ben, half asleep, made a soft humming sound that might have been a laugh. The apartment was too quiet after that. James wandered into the kitchen, rinsing a glass just to have something to do. He told himself he was only awake because the storm hadn't fully passed, but his ears kept tracking the faint rhythm of Ben's breathing from the couch. Steady. Peaceful. He leaned against the counter, staring at the window. Raindrops shimmered on the glass like tiny lanterns. This was why he didn't let people in. Especially not bright, honey-scented chaos, who didn't understand how fragile order could be. And yet, there was something in the quiet. A warmth, a hum under the cedar still clinging to the air. James glanced at the fridge. A single magnetic hook hung on the door, the one he'd meant to use for a spare key that never seemed necessary. For one dizzy second, he imagined another key hanging there. Pear-shaped charm, maybe, mismatched and cheerful. He shook the thought away, annoyed with himself. Outside, the rain finally began to ease. The storm's last rumble rolled over the city, and the apartment settled into calm. When James finally turned off the kitchen light, he paused to look back at the couch. Ben had shifted in his sleep, one hand curled around the edge of the blanket, a faint smile ghosting across his lips. The room smelled faintly of cedar, smoke, and honey. James closed the door to his room, but he didn't shut it all the way. Chapter 2. You're allergic to fun, aren't you? The apartment woke to neat pings from James's calendar, soft reminders in a sequence as precise as his breathing. 7:15, shower. 7:28, espresso. 7:32, emails. The order held his morning together like joints in a well-built truss. It began to come apart at espresso, because the kitchen already smelled like vanilla and frying butter, and the noise wasn't a polite ping, but Ben humming something wildly off-key and enthusiastic. James stopped at the threshold, barefoot, jaw tightening on instinct. Ben had claimed the kitchen as if it were a stage. The oversized black shirt, the same one, hung to mid-thigh over borrowed socks with little pears stitched on the ankles. An apron he had unearthed from the bottom drawer was tied too loosely around his narrow waist. A whisk moved like a conductor's baton through a bowl. The stovetop was a constellation of batter splatters. "Morning," Ben said, sliding a pancake that resembled a topographical error onto a plate. "You like your circles abstract, right?" James felt his pulse step deliberately into a new rhythm. Abstract is not a synonym for undercooked. I can fix that. Ben flipped another with terrifying confidence. It landed somewhat in the pan. He beamed anyway. Do alphas eat joy, or are you fasting? I eat, James said, crossing to the sink to rescue his espresso ritual, in silence. Noted. Ben lowered his voice a theatrical half-octave, as if whispering made his humming less illegal. Silent joy. I can accommodate a fun allergy. James set the portafilter, tamped, turned. A smear of batter on Ben's cheek caught at the edge of his vision like a sun flare, irritating and compelling. He reached for the nearest paper towel, took the 2 steps across the tile, and carefully, clinically, wiped the streak away. The brief proximity brought cedar and honey into the same breath. The contact was nothing, hardly anything, a soft press of paper and restraint. Still his chest rebelled with an extra beat. Ben blinked at him, lashes damp from steam, a curl escaping to rest against his brow. Thanks, Dr. Fun. Ventilation, James said pointlessly, and turned back to the machine before he did something ill-advised with a thumb instead of a towel. They ate at the counter because the table felt too formal for chaos. Ben poured syrup like he was painting a landscape. James cut a square from the least geometric pancake and chewed. Vanilla and butter argued with the dignity of his espresso until, surprisingly, they made peace. So, Ben said around a mouthful, about last night's constitution. I have amendments. Absolutely not. Hear me out. Counter Rule 1. Singing permitted if on pancake duty. No singing after 10 still stands. 9:59 and 59 seconds? 10, James said, but it came out softer than he meant. Counter Rule 2. Snack shelf gets a community section. Otherwise it's class warfare and I'm the proletariat. Class warfare, James repeated, flat. With chips, Ben said brightly. I'll consider an allocation. James took another bite to stall the part, where he added, within reason. You negotiating with a man in your shirt? Ben waggled his brows, then grinned when James's gaze flickered and escaped to his coffee. Got it. We're getting somewhere. They cleared dishes together. Ben's idea of rinsing was a watercolor of suds and apology. When he reached for the dish towel, James caught the edge of his own sleeve. Pear. Subtle, unmistakable. He inhaled, then did it again to confirm he wasn't imagining things. His work shirt smelled faintly of honeyed pear and the ghost of last night's lavender soap. Laundry, he said before he could stop himself. Yeah? Ben plucked the towel from his hands, hip-bumping the dishwasher closed like he'd always known where it was. I folded the dry stuff. You're welcome. I did a scent blanket run for me, so I might have cross-pollinated. Accidentally. On purpose. James's heartbeat stuttered for no sensible reason. My shirts are not scented. They are now. You're welcome again. He should have objected. He found himself instead going to the bedroom to change the shirt as if removing a splinter. He tugged a clean one from the closet, buttoned it with brisk precision, and paused with his palm against the closet door. The faintest thread of pear still laced the air. Ridiculous to feel anything about it. Ridiculous to feel everything. By the time he returned, Ben had arranged the salvageable pancakes into a stack and written "sorry" on top in syrup, then eaten the S and the O. He handed James his jacket. We need groceries, he announced. Your kitchen is a museum, and I need props. I have staples. You have almonds alphabetized by roast. Ben produced a list written in neat looping letters. Milk, fruit, vegetables that aren't celery, narratively interesting snacks. What constitutes a narratively interesting snack? You'll know it when it sees you across a crowded aisle. He herded them toward the door with an energy that reminded James of a hummingbird corralling a glacier. James let himself be corralled. That was the first concession he noticed. Likely there were others, smaller, already sliding under his defenses like light under a door. The market had Saturday people. Couples comparing lettuces, a toddler in boots demanding blueberries with the entitlement of royalty. Ben took the cart and immediately pushed it like a race car, heel-toe through the produce section, executing a narrow miss around a pyramid of apples. Ben, James said, catching up, this is not. A track, I know. Ben plucked a pear, held it up beside his face, then put it in the cart and added 3 more. Don't you want your house to smell like me on purpose? James pictured his entryway saturated with pear and sunlight and felt something twist pleasantly in his ribs. We came for eggs. "We came for Story," Ben said, already selecting strawberries with a seriousness he rarely applied to anything else. "How do you say these are ripe without squeezing like a villain?" "You asked the vendor," James said, and did. The vendor smiled, offered a sample. Ben's thanks was warm enough to steam the refrigerated cases. They moved through aisles with the momentum of a compromise. Ben added too many sweet things, by any sane metric, 2 types of chocolate, tart gummies, cinnamon crisps with a fox on the box that he assured James were essential to the plot, and James, almost on reflex, put some back. Ben waited until his attention shifted to deciphering a label before slipping them in again. They made it past the cereal with only one argument about marshmallows. At the tea aisle, Ben slowed, peering at tins like they were museum pieces. "You have that fancy kettle and no tea," he said. "We're fixing your soul." "My soul is fine. Your soul is a bare shelf." Ben leaned closer, lowered his voice. "Grumpy, Daddy." The words slid like a pebble across a smooth surface and landed with a small, undeniable sound. James dropped the box of chamomile he had not, until that moment, intended to buy. It hit the floor with a papery complaint. Ben caught it, smug and startled all at once. "Wow," he said lightly, putting the box in the cart. "Strong reaction to flowers." "Watch your language," James said, because his body had chosen a wordless electricity, and his brain had to compensate with something. "Which part?" Ben asked innocently. His eyes were very bright. The cashier had benches of succulents behind her, and a look that suggested she'd seen this kind of scene before. She scanned items and lifted an eyebrow at the chocolate pile. "Cute," she said, aiming it like a pebble at both of them. "We're not," James began. "Cute," Ben finished at the same time, and they both stopped, caught in the mirror of their denial. The cashier laughed without malice and told them about the loyalty program. Ben signed up under the name Community Snack Fund. James pretended that wasn't charming. The elevator at their building shuddered once on the way up. Not dangerously, just enough to remind the body that gravity can change its mind. Ben swayed and, without thinking, splayed his palm against James's chest to steady himself. Cedar met honey like flint and tinder. No spark, exactly, but heat from friction, an awareness sliding into the space between ribs. His hand was warm even through the shirt. The heel of it rested over James's sternum as if it had always belonged there. Ben's eyes flicked up in a question. James kept breathing. He didn't step back. "You okay?" Ben asked softly as the lift continued its mild complaint. "You're the one leaning," James managed. Ben said, a sound that contained pleasure and mischief and something like relief, and removed his hand as if placing it somewhere carefully, willfully unremarkable. Back in the apartment, Ben unpacked groceries like he was staging a set. Strawberries glowed in a bowl on the counter. The chocolate migrated to the top shelf, out of easy reach, so he would have to climb onto the counter to get it later. James watched, already anticipating the moment, and had to reroute his thoughts. Pears took up permanent residence in a ceramic dish by the window. Plants appeared where there had been clean lines. Ben produced them from a canvas tote he'd smuggled along. A trailing pothose that softened the bookshelf's corner. A speckled snake plant posted like a sentinel by the door. A small rosemary bush that made the kitchen smell like memory. He labeled canisters with a pen he'd stolen from the junk drawer. Flour became cloud stuff. Sugar became yes chef. Coffee became architect fuel. James followed, feigning disapproval. "That is not the label maker font. It's better, it's handwriting, it's human. It's crooked. It's character," Ben said, stepping back to examine his work. He cocked his head. "There. Now your apartment looks less like a high-end showroom and more like somewhere a person could laugh." James's phone buzzed. He typed with his thumb, the message traveling a path he had intended never to take. "You gave him the address, didn't you?" Lily's reply arrived like a cascade of confetti. 12 heart emojis and a single pair. He put the phone face down on the counter, but not before a smile, traitorously uninvited, tried to shape itself into his mouth. He suppressed it, because suppression had been his superpower since he was a teenager and needed to be angrier than he felt. The afternoon slid into evening without milestones. Ben established a quiet campaign of coziness. A throw draped over the sofa that looked like it belonged. A candle on the coffee table that he promised he would never, ever light near the models. 2 mugs by the kettle, one with a pear decal he'd smuggled home from the market because theme matters. James cooked because there was suddenly someone to cook for. Nothing elaborate, he was still himself, but the act of standing at the stove and asking garlic out loud felt foreign and rewarding. Ben sat on the counter, feet swinging, giving disastrously sincere feedback. I like when food tastes like a person cared. They ate on the sofa with a documentary playing in the background that neither could track. Ben's bright energy had strata. It wasn't all surface. Later in the half-light, he sank slowly back into the cushions, words slackening, eyes sliding shut mid-sentence. His head tipped toward James's shoulder, then away again, his body catching itself with a small jerk like it remembered falling. James took the universal hint and fetched the blanket. The second concession, he did it without telling himself not to. He draped it over Ben and stood there a moment, hands on either side of the back of the sofa, looking down at a face that didn't know how to guard itself even in sleep. A curl had fallen across his eyebrow again. James's hand rose as if pulled on a string. At the last instant, when the tips of his fingers could have tucked the curl behind Ben's ear with the kind of thoughtless intimacy he refused himself, he stopped. He lowered his hand, curled it into a fist, and pressed it into his pocket until the urge fractured into smaller, useful impulses. He adjusted the blanket instead. He stepped back. I don't do mates, he told himself in the same voice he used to recite structural load calculations. The statement used to feel like a beam set into concrete. Tonight it sounded more like a rule taped to a wall in crooked handwriting. True until life wrote around it. On the screen, a narrator murmured about bridges that sang in high winds. Ben made a sleep noise. Contented. Low. The rosemary by the window stirred when the balcony door sighed, and the apartment breathed like a living thing. James crossed to the balcony and stood outside for a long moment. Rain had become a fine mist that wrote itself in silver on the rail. The city beyond flickered, all those lit squares with their millions of small evening rituals. Someone stirring soup, someone kicking off shoes, someone deciding not to be alone anymore. He closed the door partway against a draft that smelled like honey and wet concrete. The breeze pressed a last cool palm to his cheek and withdrew. When he turned back, he didn't open a window. He walked past the models, each under their glass like the idea of perfection, and glanced toward the couch. Ben had rolled onto his side, one knee tucked up, the blanket kicked down just enough to make James fix it. Again. Community snacks, he murmured, as if that small revolution could account for the strange ease moving into his chest, as if renaming a shelf could rename a life. He stood there long enough to commit the quiet arrangement to memory, the curve of Ben's hand on the cushion, the way his mouth softened without an audience, the light from the television catching on the pear decal of the mug left on the table. He turned off the screen. The apartment didn't go dark. The plants carried their own small color, the city brought its pulse, and the kitchen held the day's warmth between rosemary and sugar. He went to his room, but this time he left the door open, just enough for the sound of breathing to thread the hall, like a song he wasn't ready to admit he wanted to learn. Chapter 3. I don't do mates, remember? Dawn cracked through the blinds in quiet slats of gold. The apartment was still, save for the sound of dishes clinking in the sink. James was halfway through grinding coffee when he heard it, the soft hitch of breath that wasn't quite laughter. He turned. Ben stood by the counter in one of his borrowed shirts, curls messy, cheeks flushed a shade too bright. He was smiling, but the sound that came out of him trembled at the edges. You okay? James asked, frowning. Yeah, Ben said too quickly. He reached for a mug, missed the handle, and it clattered onto the counter. His fingers trembled. Just not enough sleep, I think. The smell hit next. The honey pear of Ben's scent sharpened, richer, dizzying. It spread through the air like sugar melting on heat, sticky and sweet. James froze, the alpha in him rising before he could leash it back. Instinct hummed in his bones. Protect, provide, hold, but he forced a breath through his nose and stepped back, knuckles whitening around the counter's edge. Ben? His voice was steady, but deeper than usual. You're burning up. Ben gave a small laugh, dry at the edges. Lucky guess. He pressed a hand to his forehead, then the back of his neck. His pupils had blown wide, pulse flickering visibly under his throat. The air shimmered with pheromones that made James's chest tighten. "I'm fine," Ben said, even as his voice shook. "I just need a minute." He turned and hurried down the hall, almost tripping on the rug. The guest room door shut with a solid click, followed by the metallic slide of a lock. James leaned back against the counter, dragging both hands over his face. He'd known plenty of Omegas, professionally, socially. He'd helped friends through heats before, dropped off supplies, never lingered. He could handle this. He had control. Except this scent wasn't like anything he'd known. It hit too personal, like a memory he'd never made but had always been waiting for. He took a long breath, grounding himself in cedar and smoke, then went to the linen closet. A towel, a pack of cool gel compresses, bottled water. He lined them up on the counter like tools before a project. Then he walked to the closed door and knocked once gently. "Ben," he said quietly, "I'm leaving water and cool packs by the door. I won't come in." A pause, then a muffled, strained voice. "I can manage." "I know you can," James said, "but you don't have to alone." No answer, just the sound of uneven breathing on the other side. He set the items down carefully, resting his hand for a brief second against the wood. "They're right here. I'll stay nearby." The latch stayed closed. James sank down with his back to the door, elbows on his knees, listening. The air on this side of the wood was warm, on the other it felt molten. For a while, silence. Then soft, stuttering breaths that tugged at every protective instinct he'd spent years burying. "Ben?" A faint laugh, cracked and small. "You're still there?" "Yeah," he said, voice low. "You want me to leave?" "No." The word came out almost a whisper. "Can you just talk, please?" James's throat tightened. He shifted, sitting straighter. "About what?" "Anything," Ben murmured, voice thick with fever. "Something steady." So James talked. About the bridge he was designing, the new suspension line that curved like a half-smile across the river. About the way the tension cables could sing in the wind when the resonance hit right. About the math that felt like poetry if you looked close enough. He didn't know if Ben understood any of it, but he kept talking, the sound of his voice filling the space between breaths. The air softened around them. The sharp sweetness mellowed into something slower, deeper, like honey thickening. James could feel his pulse sinking with the rhythm of Ben's shallow breathing. Every few minutes he slid another cool pack under the crack in the door. He heard the faint rustle as Ben picked it up. Sometimes a whisper followed. "Thanks." Barely audible, but enough to keep him anchored. He told himself this wasn't crossing a line. It was care. It was protection. It was what you did when someone trusted you enough to ask for help in a moment that stripped them raw. Hours passed in increments of quiet. The city outside shifted from dawn to early light. James's legs had gone numb when Ben's voice came again. Softer now, hazed and honest. "You're the only alpha," he said through the door, "who's ever made me feel safe." The sentence landed like a punch wrapped in velvet. James pressed his palms against the floor, grounding himself. "You're safe here," he said, and meant it. "I won't take advantage." He leaned his head back against the wall, the cedar in his skin fighting the pull to break that promise. Every instinct screamed to go in, to soothe, to scent, to hold. But control was a choice, and he clung to it like oxygen. "I know," Ben whispered. Then silence, the kind that sounded like surrender, not to fear, but to trust. James stayed there until the pattern of Ben's breath steadied into something like sleep. When dawn bled into the room through the narrow hall window, the door creaked open. Ben stood there, unsteady, wrapped in a blanket that trailed behind him like a cape. His cheeks were flushed, his curls stuck to his forehead, and his eyes, bleary but bright, found James sitting slumped against the wall. "You stayed," he said, voice rough. James nodded once. "You shouldn't be up yet." "I'm fine." Ben's smile tilted sideways. "You look worse than me." He sank down beside him before James could protest, curling carefully against his side, the blanket sliding to half cover them both. Ben didn't reach out, didn't cling. He simply rested his head on James's shoulder, like gravity had decided for him. James's breath caught in his chest. He didn't move for 3 heartbeats, afraid even to inhale too deep. Then instinct, gentler this time, took over. He lifted the edge of the blanket, tucking it around Ben's shoulders, shielding him from the chill that lingered in the hallway. The apartment was quiet, except for the rhythmic sound of breathing. One slow, one steady. The air smelled like what he imagined comfort would, if it had a scent. Cedar smoke and honeyed warmth, perfectly balanced. When Ben's breathing evened out completely, James let his head tilt just slightly until it rested against Ben's curls. He stayed like that until the light in the hallway turned gold. By the time he stood, careful not to wake him, the decision not to call it a bond felt more like denial than truth. The kettle whistled faintly when James returned to the kitchen. His hands shook once when he reached for the tea tin, and he steadied them by focusing on routine, water, leaves, heat, precision. He glanced toward the hallway. Ben was still asleep, curled up in the doorway like a fallen note at the end of a song. James leaned against the counter, letting the steam rise between his fingers. Sunlight caught on the faint sheen of sweat still clinging to his skin from the long night. He looked at his reflection in the window, tired eyes, rumpled hair, something too tender beneath the exhaustion. He thought about rules, the ones that had kept his life quiet, orderly, safe. I don't do mates. The phrase had once been armor. Now it sounded hollow, like a bridge missing its final span. If he touched Ben for real, not the careful shoulder, not the blanket, not the measured distance of control, but really reached out, let himself fall into the gravity, pulling him closer every hour, he wouldn't stop. The thought was terrifying and warm. He poured the tea into 2 mugs, set one on the table beside a plate of toast he didn't remember making. The scent of pear still lingered faintly in the air. Behind him, a soft rustle. Ben leaned against the doorway, still wrapped in his blanket, hair a wild halo. His eyes found the tea first, then James. "Morning," Ben rasped, voice hoarse but lighter. "You should rest," James said, turning before Ben could read too much in his face. "I did," Ben said, patting closer. "Thanks for staying." James nodded, eyes on the steam. "You needed someone to count with." Ben smiled, slow and warm. "You did more than that." He sank onto a chair, wrapping his fingers around the mug, inhaling the warmth. "You always this good in a crisis, or just when I'm the one melting down?" "Only when you're involved," James said, before he could stop himself. Ben looked up, startled, and then softly smiled. The light from the window turned his curls to gold. James looked away first. His tea was too hot, but he drank it anyway. The rule had fractured. He felt the break all the way down to where his heartbeat had learned a new rhythm overnight. He didn't do mates, but he had stayed, and somehow that felt like the first promise he hadn't been able to keep from meaning. Chapter 4. You keep taking my space and my peace. The morning smelled like rosemary and toast and the faint afterglow of relief. The storm that had roared through Ben's body had passed. What it left in its wake felt like a hush in the apartment, a quiet the color of warm bread. James stood at the stove, buttering a second slice, even though he'd already calculated optimal caloric intake and decided against it. He told himself it was because Ben would steal the first piece and then complain about being hungry. He told himself a lot of things these days. Ben padded in, the black shirt sliding over bare thighs, hair doing whatever it wanted. He looked human again, not the burning thing James had kept company through a door. His eyes were playful, mouth already ready with mischief. "You snore like a tractor." "Architects don't snore," James said, not turning. He pushed down 2 more slices for cover. "I don't know what brand of denial that was at 4 a.m., but the neighbors called to ask if you'd help plow their fields." Ben scooted up onto the counter, swinging his legs. The pear socks had been laundered. The little stitched fruit beamed smugly at James from the edge of the cabinet. It was very pastoral. "Eat," James said, placing the first toast on a plate and sliding it toward him. Ben stole it mid-slide, teeth catching the corner with a grin. "You care," he sing-songed around the bite. "You're an omega in recovery. I'm minimizing variables," James said, which was the same thing with an engineer's wallpaper. Ben took another bite and, with no warning whatsoever, reached for James's plate and stole the second slice too. "For the variable," he said. Their fingers brushed, a soft, unremarkable contact that lit up every nerve ending anyway. They both looked away at the same time and smiled at nothing. "Community toast," Ben declared, chewing. He swallowed and dropped his voice to something that wasn't teasing. "Thanks for yesterday. I know it wasn't easy." "It wasn't hard," James said, which surprised them both with how true it was. Ben went quiet for a beat, studying him. "You're good at staying." So our foundations, James said, and Ben's laugh hit him square in the chest. He let the laugh settle inside him like a brace. He found that, when Ben was in a room, there was always a new way to stand. Ben ran out at noon to help Lily pick up a shelf she'd found for her studio. "It's hideous, but in a way I love," he'd said. He left behind a trail of notes on sticky flags. One on the fridge, "Drink water, you cryptid." One on the plant by the door, "We're rooting for you." One on James's laptop, "No work after 7, signed Human Resources." James removed the last one and set it under the rosemary pot to keep it from flying off. That was the same as ignoring it. The apartment exhaled. In the quiet, James tried to work. He opened the bridge file out of habit. Stress distribution graphs, load pathways, the elegant curve that had lived in his brain for months. The numbers did the thing they always did, took shape, sang their thin, pure song. But his pen hovered uselessly above the page because the room wasn't humming. There was no off-key orchestra warming up in the kitchen. No gentle clatter of someone bumping a knee against a cabinet because their body moved faster than their awareness. There was no scratch of a label pen on glass. The silence was precise and sterile, and used to be what he had chosen. Today it felt like a coat that wouldn't warm him. He replayed in his mind how Ben had said it through a door, "You're the only alpha who's ever made me feel safe." He'd never known a sentence could ask so little and give him so much responsibility. Or maybe it wasn't a responsibility at all. Maybe it was permission. He put the pen down and picked up his phone to check his afternoon calendar, a structural review he could have done in his sleep. A site visit that could be handed off. He was a man who did not hand things off. He was also a man, apparently, who did not like his apartment when it did not carry the shape of Ben's presence. Without thinking, he sent 2 emails. One to the junior architect who'd been eager to prove herself, another to the project manager who'd been pleading for more air. He rearranged his schedule to be home earlier. He did not clock the choice until after he'd pressed send. Then he sat back and stared at what he'd done, and couldn't find regret anywhere. By late afternoon, the city had softened into that honeyed hour when glass is a little gentler and even traffic sounds like it's trying. James was setting mugs by the kettle, one black, one with a pear decal, when his phone lit with a client's name. He took it because he always took it. "That deck was due at 3, the voice said without a greeting. "The render was missing a facade update. We're bleeding time." "Check your inbox," James said evenly, one eye on the counter. "You have version 6. Is there a reason the revisions were slow? We buy you to be faster." "I'm not a commodity." His tone did not shift enough to count as anger. "You have the deck. We'll see if it passes muster." The call ended with the digital equivalent of a door slam. James exhaled and set the phone down, face pressed hard. A muscle in his jaw twitched once, twice, refusing to release. He turned to reach for the rosemary, meaning to crush a leaf to reset his breath, and in the same motion his forearm knocked the spout of the watering can that Ben had left standing between the models and the window after a midday attention burst. A fat bead of water tipped over the lip, wobbled, then fell. It splashed onto the corner of a cardboard massing model, the one for a civic center he'd been methodically shaping, a long, patient thing with interlocking courtyards. A dark bloom spread along one edge. The damage was cosmetic, minimal. But it was a violation of the controlled field where he did not get surprised. Something in him snapped open. "Damn it!" Ben stepped in from the hallway, hair sunlit from the balcony glass, eyes widening. "Hey, what happened?" "Nothing," James said, too sharp. "It's a model. It's fine." Ben stepped closer, saw the bloom of water and the watering can where it shouldn't be. "Oh," he winced. "I meant to move that. Sorry, I got a text and..." "You got a text and left it there," James said, the sentence sharpening itself. "You treat every room like a playground." Ben went very still. Not defensive, that would have been easier to answer, but hurt, like someone had pressed down on a bruise. "And you treat care like it's clutter," he said quietly. "I was watering the plants so your apartment would feel less like a hospital. Sorry my being here messes up your perfect quiet." "It's not," James started, and the truth he needed slipped under the argument like water under a door. "It's not your being here." He couldn't catch the words in time. The moment closed. Ben's mouth twisted into something like a smile and failed. "Thanks for the data." he said softly. Then he turned, crossing the living room with 2 careful steps, and went out to the balcony. The door slid shut with the slow patience of well-oiled mechanisms. James stood alone in the kitchen. The rosemary watched him like a witness. He picked up the model and set it away from the can. His hands knew how to fix the damage. His chest did not. Outside, the city lights were coming on. From the doorway, he could see Ben's silhouette leaning into the railing. The line of his shoulders pitched a little forward, like he'd been pushed by something he couldn't name. The sky was a deepening slate, smeared with a last smear of gold. The glass between them was thin and ridiculous, and everything. He washed the can and dried it and put it in a corner that made sense. He cleaned the tiny pooled water from the table with precision and paper towels, and rubbed his hands over his face once to take off whatever mask he'd been wearing. He cued the kettle and got down 2 chamomile bags from the new Healing and Other Lies tin Ben had bought. He reached for the wax pencil and a plain cardboard box from the pantry and wrote in block letters so crooked he wouldn't have allowed them on a job site, Snack Community. He left it where Ben would see it. Sometimes you couldn't fix a model by trimming. Sometimes you had to build a second structure beside the first and let them lean on each other. You're an idiot, he told himself, which was progress because it wasn't aimed at Ben. He slid the balcony door back open. The honeyed air of evening came in, carrying city heat, the ghost of rain, and the quiet ache of a person choosing to stand outside instead of inside with you. Ben, he said, voice already roughened by apology he hadn't shaped yet. Ben didn't turn. I won't touch your models, he said evenly. And I'll keep my plants to my corner. We can revert to one-night rules if you want. I'll figure out the rest. That's not what I want. The words came easier than he expected because they were true. I was angry at the mess, not at you. A beat. Ben's shoulders shifted, a small uncoiling. He turned, bracing his elbows on the rail behind him, the shirt sliding along his collarbone. I know the difference between being tolerated and being wanted, he said, voice low. Choose, James. The skyline breathed. Somewhere below, a siren sighed and cut out. James could feel his schedule rearranging itself again, not in his calendar app, but in his ribcage. He swallowed. He stopped. He had never been good at naming things that could cut him if he got them wrong. He tried again. I want you. In my space. And for it to be yours, too. Ben's mouth tilted into a smile that wasn't victory. It was relief. He stepped past James into the kitchen, rolling the sleeves of the black shirt to his elbows as if the action could right the world, and busied himself with the kettle. Okay, he said softly. Then we'll learn each other's corners. He caught sight of the crooked label on the box, and his eyes went soft in a way that made James feel structurally unsound. He traced a finger over the word community, like he was blessing it. He set 2 mugs down and poured hot water over chamomile. The steam smelled like calmer nights. James stood in the doorway to the kitchen and let himself come all the way back. I'm sorry, he said again, forcing his gaze to hold. You matter more than clean lines. That's good, Ben said, distracted by the tea bag he was coaxing with a spoon, because I will ruin many lines. He glanced up and found James still looking at him. His voice softened. I get that you built a life that didn't need extras. I just don't want to be an extra. I don't want to be tolerated because you're kind. I want to be wanted because I'm me. James's answer came up from somewhere behind his ribs. You are not tidy, he said, like a confession. You are not convenient. His mouth did that almost smile of his. You are necessary. Ben made a sound that might have been a laugh, and might have been him remembering how not to cry. He held out a mug. His hand shook a little, and James steadied it with a palm under Ben's fingers, because sometimes support was consent, too. They stood very close without quite touching, the air between them a taut wire humming with the least breeze. James reached up. He paused when his hand hovered inches from Ben's cheek. Okay? He asked, the word a check, a gate, a gift. Ben nodded once, eyes bright. Okay. The first kiss tasted like warm floral in a day too long and forgiveness. James was careful with it, steady as measure, slow as dawn on a glass facade. He learned the shape of Ben's mouth by increments, how to fit, how to give room. Ben's fingers found the seam of his shirt and held on, like he was locating himself on a map. James felt the soft slide of cotton as his fingers brushed Ben's shoulder, and the shirt slipped half an inch, exposing the curve where neck became shoulder. Ben's breath shivered. He made a small sound like approval and tipped his head, offering more without asking for anything else. James kept his mouth at the corner of Ben's cheek, the line of his jaw, every movement announced by a lift of his eyes and a question that Ben kept answering with yes. The apartment smelled like cedar rolling through honey, a scent braid that made the big, empty spaces feel occupied in a way furniture couldn't. They exhaled together, a shared relief that shook something loose inside both of them. James pulled back first because he knew his own edges. He put his forehead against Ben's to breathe the same small square of air. "If I touch you again," he said, voice wrecked at the edges, "I'm never letting you go." Ben smiled with a kind of certainty that only people who have been lonely for a long time can manage. "Then stop pretending you don't want to." He lifted up on his toes and kissed him this time. Longer, warmer, an answer more than a question. James let himself be answered. They drifted to the sofa the way falling water finds a channel, not pressed together with desperation, but folded in with care, shoulders leaning, knees finding a geometry that didn't pinch, ankles crossing and recrossing until they learned a shared rhythm. The chamomile cooled on the table, forgotten. "Let's talk," Ben said, voice low, like he was afraid to spook the moment. "About heat support, about rules that are not punishment, but scaffolding." "Scaffolding is temporary," James said, out of habit. "Then call them handrails. I like those." Ben grinned. "Okay. I need you to promise we will always check in before touch when I'm running hot. I need cool packs and water, and I need you to talk. Your voice helps." "I can do that," James said. He waited. "And for me, I need you to tell me if you want me to leave. I'll do it, even if it feels wrong to me." Ben nodded. "I can do that." They kept going. What no secrets meant, how they would handle the world seeing them at the market and calling them cute. Where yes stopped for tonight, mouths, hands, nothing that would make morning feel like a question, where the emergency snacks lived. The shape of their laughter when they said something too earnest and had to wrap it in humor. "We go slow," Ben said finally, leaning his temple against James's. "But we don't lie." "We don't lie," James echoed. Saying it out loud felt like setting a keystone. They tipped sideways on the cushions, a careful, unremarkable tilt that put them closer without the burn of urgency. Ben's hand found James's and threaded their fingers together like it was a habit he was auditioning for. James tightened once, and then rested, a promise in the way his palm curved around Ben's knuckles. At some point, Ben's head slid down to James's shoulder. At some point after that, James's cheek found the crown of Ben's curls. The television wasn't on, but the city served up its own soft soundtrack. Tires on wet pavement, far laughter, a dog protesting bedtime 3 buildings over. Hearts unrushed, learned to idle beside each other. James's phone buzzed against the coffee table. Ben stirred and reached without lifting his cheek from James's shoulder. He squinted at the screen and snorted. "From your sister," he announced, amusement climbing into his voice. "A text that didn't deliver the other night. If he scowls, that means he likes you." James huffed something that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't not one. "She weaponizes my face." "She reads it," Ben said, turning his head to press the softest kiss to the outside of James's hand, right where thumb met palm. It wasn't a claim so much as a thanks. "I do too." James didn't say anything to that. He pressed his lips to Ben's hair and felt the shape of the day settle into place like a beam finally finding its notch. They fell asleep, tangled at the knees, fully dressed, the chamomile gone cold, the snack community box drying in crooked letters on the counter. Outside, the city went on with its neon declarations and late dinners. Inside, the apartment didn't echo. It answered back. Chapter 5. Guess you wanted a mate after all. Morning sunlight poured through the windows like honey, slow, deliberate, golden. The apartment had stopped echoing. It breathed differently now, like the air itself had learned their rhythm. 2 mugs sat side by side on the counter, one matte black, one white with a pear decal that caught the light. 2 keys hung from the magnetic hook on the fridge, one engraved E in neat steel lines, the other marked with a crooked heart Ben had doodled on with a permanent marker. A new fiddle leaf fig stood by the balcony door, leaves glossy and shamelessly alive. James's cufflinks, once lined in his drawer like soldiers, had migrated to a dish Ben had labeled in looping script, "Important Shiny." Every corner had changed. Every corner had softened. When James walked from room to room, the quiet didn't mock him anymore. It answered back, with laughter, with scent, with life. Shh. Saturday began with the clatter of keys and Lily Everett's voice barreling through the front door. "You're lucky I love you both enough to bring croissants." Ben jumped at the sudden intrusion, nearly spilling coffee grounds all over the counter. He was wearing James's hoodie again. Black, oversized, sleeves swallowing his hands. His hair was a soft disaster, still sleep-fluffed. "Lily, you can't just break into people's apartments. Family privilege." She set the pastry box on the table and took in the scene. Ben barefoot, humming. James in his usual pressed shirt, utterly unbothered. 2 mugs steaming in unison. "Well, this looks disgustingly domestic," Ben blushed. "We're just living together, sharing caffeine, wearing his hoodie," Lily said with mock seriousness. "Yeah, totally platonic." James tried to glare, but the corners of his mouth betrayed him. "Would you like coffee, or are you here for the audit?" "Both," she said cheerfully, pouring herself a cup. "So, how long have you two been doing this whole mated in everything but paperwork thing?" Ben froze mid-stir. James cleared his throat. Lily tilted her head, studying her brother. "James Everett, serial loner, emotionally unavailable architect. Explain yourself." James met her gaze without flinching. "He's my mate." The words dropped into the air like something heavier than they sounded. Ben turned, eyes wide, coffee spoon still in hand. Lily blinked, then she smiled. "By choice." "By choice," James said simply. Her grin softened into something tender. "About time, Grumpy. I always knew you needed someone who'd ruin your symmetry." She kissed Ben on the cheek and added, "Thank you for existing." When she left, the apartment seemed to hold her laughter for a while. Then it faded, leaving quiet full of warmth. Ben leaned against the counter, heart racing. "You just told her." "I did." James's mouth twitched. "You look surprised." "I thought you'd give a TED talk about not labeling relationships," Ben teased. "I'm done labeling," James said, stepping closer. "I'm building." Ben smiled, dizzy and happy all at once. "You really are the worst flirt. And you keep falling for it," James murmured, brushing his knuckles against Ben's jaw before turning away to rescue the croissants from burning. By afternoon, the city pulsed with life, and they were part of it, hand in hand, moving through the farmers' market as if it were their new weekend ritual. Ben was giddy with small joys. The smell of strawberries, the sound of someone strumming guitar by the fountain, the easy weight of James's hand on his. They were debating honey brands when someone called James's name. A tall alpha with too perfect hair approached, smile slick as varnish. James Everett. Been ages. Ben recognized the tone, the kind that assumed history. "Evan," James said politely, without warmth. Evan's gaze flicked between them, landing on Ben. "And you are?" James's hand tightened fractionally. "My partner, Ben." No hesitation, no glance for approval, just truth. Evan's smile faltered. "Partner," he echoed, then laughed thinly. "Didn't think you were the type." "Apparently I'm full of surprises," James said. He turned back to Ben, his whole attention a quiet claim. "Which one did you want again? The wildflower honey?" Ben's throat felt full, but he managed to smile. "Yeah, that one." When Evan walked off, the sunlight felt warmer somehow. Ben looked up at him. "Partner, huh?" James's mouth softened. "That word work for you?" "It feels like sunlight," Ben said, and meant it. Later, afternoon melted toward amber. The world outside blurred in soft heat. The inside of the apartment carried a quieter pulse, steady, grounding. Ben sat perched on the dresser, legs swinging slightly, still laughing from a joke about the honey jar that wouldn't open. James stood between his knees, gaze drawn upward, gentle, intent. They hadn't needed to fill the silence for a long time now. James's hand slid along Ben's thigh, not possessive, just present. He leaned in and kissed him, slow, reverent, the kind of kiss that built foundations instead of walls. Ben's fingers traced the edge of his collar, tilting his chin. The kiss deepened, still unhurried, a conversation made of breath and warmth. James's lips traveled along Ben's jaw, down to the place just beneath his ear. He stopped there, murmuring, "Marked by choice." The words hummed through Ben's skin, grounding him. He tilted his head slightly in silent invitation. James kissed the spot once, slow and careful, and then again, leaving nothing but warmth and cedar and the quiet certainty of being seen. Ben's breath hitched. "James, still okay?" "Yeah," Ben whispered. "Better than okay." They stayed like that, close but unhurried, breaths mingling, the scent of pear and smoke winding together until it smelled like home. The next morning dawned lazy and golden. Ben was at the stove again, this time confidently flipping pancakes that were actually round. His curls were tied up messily with a rubber band he'd stolen from the junk drawer. The apartment smelled like vanilla, coffee, and contentment. James leaned against the counter, watching him, still in sleep-warm clothes. Ben caught his gaze and grinned. "What? You doubted my pancake arc." "I doubted the geometry," James said. "Well, you doubted wrong." Ben slid a perfect golden disc onto a plate and pointed with his spatula. "Try it. You might find enlightenment." James reached over instead and stole a piece straight from Ben's fingers, biting it cleanly before Ben could react. "Hey!" Ben yelped. "Thief!" "Quality control," James said, chewing. "It's very round. I approve." "Good, because this is breakfast for two, not one moody alpha." James set the plate down, caught Ben by the waist, and pulled him close enough to feel his laughter. "So," Ben said, eyes dancing, "still don't believe in mates?" James pressed a kiss to the faint mark beneath Ben's ear, the one he'd made the day before. It glowed faintly in morning light. Not a bond forced by biology, but one chosen by both of them. "Only in you," he murmured. Ben smiled, eyes bright, voice fond. "Good answer, Grumpy." He fed James another bite. "And next time, I get to steal your toast again." James laughed softly, wrapping an arm around him from behind. "You already stole everything that mattered." Dusk came softly that evening, wrapping the balcony in gold and rose. The plants rustled in a slow wind, the fiddle leaf, the rosemary, the little pots Ben had rescued from clearance shelves. 2 mugs steamed on the table. 1 cedar dark, 1 honey sweet. The city stretched beneath them, all amber and heartbeat. Ben leaned against the railing, wearing James's shirt, still oversized, still a symbol of beginnings. "1 shirt and a stolen snack," he said, laughing quietly. "That's all it took." James stood behind him, resting his chin lightly on Ben's shoulder. "It took you." Ben turned his head slightly, their foreheads touching, eyes soft. The world below buzzed with lights and motion, but up here it was simple. Just breath, warmth, and the scent of a home that belonged to both of them. Home. Finally tasted like pancakes and sounded like laughter. A shared space, a shared peace, a choice made daily.